Welcome to Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we talk about two additional age groups, that being adolescents and young adults, which is considered one age group, and then adults, just by themselves. And so last week we talked about, mothers that are pregnant and infants and then children, and we're moving on to young adults and adults in this chapter, and then I believe next chapter we'll talk about the elderly. And so this chapter is about understanding what's going on with the community health of this population group, what are the current issues, struggles, successes, and then what can be done to further assist them. And so starting with adolescents and young adults, this age group is 15 to 24 years old, and it represents that time in between childhood and adulthood. And in case you're interested in the history, this idea of a separate kind of age in between child and adulthood is fairly new, because in the past, people kind of just transitioned from being a child to being an adult. And I think it's only with the large-scale idea that everyone should be in school for a long time has kind of created this adolescent and young adult time period. And now we really believe in it and we think it's a real thing, but just realize that that is a fairly recent idea. This group represents the future of our nation, the future workforce, the future citizens, and then the future government people. Oftentimes you'll hear people joke about young people as they are the ones who are going to be deciding if we go into the nursing home, or they're going to be the ones in charge when we're in the nursing home. And so that's kind of just a funny way of looking back and saying, the young people, we may not understand them or particularly know what they're doing, but we should be invested in them because sooner or later they're going to be the ones that are in charge running the show. And so let's look at adolescence. Adolescence is that time from puberty when the body begins changing pretty dramatically, actually, and not just, with sex hormones and acne, but also brain development changes pretty dramatically. It's actually similar to what a very young child goes through in the first couple of years when the brain is kind of acclimating to the world. That kind of happens also again during adolescence. So you've got lots of physical changes, growing bodies, voice changing, especially for men, emotional changes, and educational changes, where the person may be leaving high school, which is fairly structured and regular and routine. There's a lot of support, and maybe going into the workforce, or maybe going into the university, or online nowadays. It's become much more of an option for people. And there's a lot less structure, kind of in all of those. If you're in university, you can choose to go to class or you can not choose to go to class. And there's a lot less punishments on that. There's a lot more freedom to do a lot of different things that maybe you wouldn't be able to do if you're in the structure of the high school. But then there's also a lot more cracks that students can fall through. And so there's just a lot more changes and burdens and, dangers and opportunities for that. It is actually considered one of the most difficult periods of one's life. At 15 to 24, your body's changing, your friends are changing, people's are kind of, they're sort of deciding what direction they want their life to go in, and maybe your friends are going in one direction and you want to go in another, so there's sort of drama involved there. People are beginning to form much more committed, emotional, and dating relationships with people, and that can be very difficult and dramatic and wonderful, potentially. And there's all these people saying, what do you want to do with your life? You could be anything. And it's like, well, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And there just seems like a lot of pressure and not a lot of structure. We like the idea of lots of choices in America, and that's why we've got like 15 different types of Cheerios that you can buy. But that can also be difficult sometimes because we don't know where to go. And sometimes the choices can become overwhelming and we're kind of stuck in what they call analysis paralysis. Like, I can't stop looking at all my options. So I'm frozen. I'm not doing anything. I'm not stepping forward because I can't decide which direction to go in. So that's a real concern for a lot of people. So this is also a time when health beliefs become more cemented. Some people at this time decide, you know what, doctors and the government, they're all quacks. One year they tell us that eggs are good for us. The next year they tell us they're terrible. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm just going to eat Doritos, Or, cigarettes are supposed to be bad for you, but my grandpa smoked them his whole life and he's still alive and kicking and there's no problems. Or it could be this decision that I don't want to, say, have the health problems that my parents and their generation have. I am going to go on this new diet that maybe everyone else thinks is crazy, but I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna eat these weird foods, and I'm gonna go to the gym on a regular basis. And those are great choices that someone can make, and when they make them young, then they're much more likely to stick long term. The same thing for cigarettes. The earlier someone can start smoking cigarettes, the likely they are to stick with that, and also stick with that brand. There's been some research that oftentimes the first cigarette that people smoke is the one that they will continue to smoke if they keep smoking. And so that is why cigarette companies try to get their cigarette to be the first one that people smoke, because the odds are they're going to stick with that one long term. So same thing with lots of other behaviors. And so this is a good time for a community that wants healthy, lifelong adults to work on the adolescents and the young adults to get the healthy behaviors cemented, because they will last, or it's likely that they will last. This is the issue with people eating junk food when they are teenagers. When you're a 17-year-old kid and your adrenaline's really hot, not your adrenaline, your metabolism is very, very high, and you could smoke and drink and eat really bad food and not sleep very much, and it doesn't really impact that person. At least maybe they don't feel it, and it's like, well, hey, this is no problem. I'll quit when I'm 27, and and everything will be fine. But realize that it's sort of like cement, in the sense that whatever habits we do in our teenage years, it's very easy and feels very natural to continue doing those, even though suddenly you need sleep when you're 27, and the foods that you could eat when you're 17 are now adding pounds to your body. But it's tough to do those changes. It's tough to make those changes when you're in your 20s. It's even harder when you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s. When I was in my teens, I could exercise very, very easily. Like, I could go from not exercising at all to exercising on a regular basis, and that was a fairly easy transition for me. Now that I'm 40, if I don't exercise for 3 weeks and then I try to go back to exercising, it is much more difficult. And so I imagine that trend will continue. If I wait until I'm 50 to start exercising, then it'll be even harder to get into that stride. So let's talk about some numbers, how many young adults there are. In 2020, there were 43 million young adults and adolescents in the United States. That represents about 13% of the population. There are an increasing number of adolescents who are younger than 18 who are living in single-parent families. This is a trend that's been building over several decades and really generations now, where more and more people are living with just one parent. And while there are upsides to that, perhaps there's less fighting between the parents now that they've separated. So it is an increasing trend, to the point where in 2010, 1 out of every 3 children lived with a single parent at one point in their life. There are more black children living in single-parent homes as compared to whites and Hispanic children. One of the unfortunate parts of living in a single-parent home is that it is much more likely that that child is going to be living in poverty. An interesting trend that is the fact that teens today are not working as much as they did in the past. This has actually been a long-term trend for the last 40 years, where teens are working less than they did in the past. And a couple of reasons for this. One, a teenager that goes to work is not going to be paid very much. And if the teen is not being paid very much, and if they're working a job, say that they don't enjoy, which many of the jobs aren't super enjoyable, then the rewards are kind of low, especially if you have parents that are really emphasizing educational goals for the child. You need to be in honors English, and you need to get an A in biology, and you need to study for the SAT. Well, that kind of crowds out the $7, $9 an hour job that the teen might have. And so maybe that's a good thing. Some people would argue that, teens should focus on education more. Other people would say that being at work is a good life lesson, and they're going to learn things on the job that they aren't necessarily going to learn in the classroom or anywhere else. Well, let's talk about the health profile of this group, starting with mortality, which is deaths. The death rate among this group has declined significantly due to advances in medicine, everything from vaccines to more advanced medical care. It used to be, for instance, that if somebody was shot by a gun, say in the chest or the head, it was much less likely that they would survive that. But due to medical advances, it's much more likely that they're going to survive that injury. Men in this group have higher mortality rates than do women. And this is because the major causes of mortality for this age group include unintended injuries. And the elephant in the room for this is motor vehicle crashes. And those account for 44% of the deaths of young people. And men are more likely to be involved in motor vehicle crashes, as men are more likely to, say, be drinking and driving at high speeds. Right? Homicides account for 16% of the deaths among this age group, and then suicides account for 13%. There has been an unfortunate increase in the number of homicides over the last 50 years, and the suicide rate is higher among men than it is among women. However, if you just look at suicide attempts, it's actually higher among women than that it is among men. It's just that men use more lethal means of attempting suicide, such as hanging or guns, whereas women maybe use less lethal means to try to kill themselves, such as cutting or taking pills. If you look at the number of people who have attempted suicide, it's as high as maybe 1 in 15 youths who are attempting suicide. So this is a really high number of people. Fortunately, very few of them comparatively are successful in their suicide attempts. I don't know if that's because they're not really wanting to commit suicide, or the methods that they're using are not successful. But this is an area where a lot of progress could be made. If you walk into a room of people who are 15 to 24 and know that, gosh, 1 out of every 15 of them have attempted suicide, well, that's a lot more than maybe you would assume. So a lot more emphasis could be put on this to prevent people. All right, well, moving on to morbidities, which relates to disease and injuries. This group is at a higher risk than the general population for sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections. Some STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, are curable, and others can be treated but never fully cured. Some of these diseases, such as HPV, have vaccines for them, and others don't. We do not yet have an HIV vaccine, although it is possible that we are close to having one. I believe there are several kind of in the wings that are being tested for their effectiveness, that maybe one day soon people will be able to receive an HIV vaccine. However, there is an HIV prevention called PrEP, which is around 99% effective at preventing HIV, whether that's received through sexual activity or injection. So I don't hear that much about PrEP, but it perhaps they're just using it to targeted groups that are more at risk of contracting HIV, such as the gay and lesbian, the gay community. But that's pretty effective, 99% effective. So let's look at behaviors that contribute to unintentional injuries. So if we look at what injuries are occurring that are causing people to die, again, it's motor vehicle accidents. That's the largest group, although it's also other things such as falling or being bruised due to bicycle injuries or things like that. So wearing a seatbelt is very effective. Bicycle helmets, not drinking and driving, not drinking and texting. These are all behaviors that would reduce the number of unintentional injuries. So, there are behaviors that are associated with contributing to violence. Now, the violence would be considered intentional injuries. So, for instance, carrying a gun or a weapon to school is associated with intentional injuries. Fighting, engaging in dating violence, suicidal ideations, bullying, and the numbers of people who are carrying a weapon to school are much higher than I would have assumed. As many as 1 out of every 8 high school students reported that they had carried a gun to school in the last month. Other behaviors that lead to injury and morbidity include tobacco use. The good news for tobacco use is that it is down significantly from decades past, especially if you were to look back to, say, the 1960s. The number of teens, young adults and adolescents that are using tobacco is down significantly. But early beginnings make it more likely that the person is going to use long term. And I think the reason why this is that the brain is shifting and developing a lot during the early time periods. And I really think it's closer to like 12, but I think it's probably going to extend to like 15 and maybe even later than that. And so if tobacco is incorporated into the body, into the brain, it's almost like the brain makes a place for it to stay. And then if the person tries to stop, it's like the brain has gotten used to it and it kind of created a place for it in itself, in its anatomy, and now the brain kind of craves it. Whereas if the person were to wait until they're, say, 21 or 22 to begin smoking, the brain has largely finished developing, although brains never finish developing. Moving on to sex. We talked about sexually transmitted diseases. So teen pregnancy is higher in this country than countries that are like the United States. So if you were to compare the teen pregnancy rate of the United States as compared to rich countries in Europe, say Britain, France, Norway, Sweden, we have a significantly higher teen pregnancy rate, and they attribute this to our sex education program, or our lack of thorough sex education program that we have in the schools. About half of high school students are reported to having sex at least one time in their life. But the truth is that teens today are having less sex than they did, even 20 years ago. Despite whatever rumors you might have heard, the truth is that young people are having less sex. I think this is because younger people are doing more things digitally on their phones or on computers than they did in the past. And that's going to kind of remove them from the situations where casual sex would have occurred in the past. Physical activity, or maybe a lack of physical activity, is a real concern, because about half of students have not been physically active at least an hour per day, which is the recommendation for this age group. So about half of the students are getting it, and half of the students are not. And this lack of activity is most prominent among racial minorities. like many other groups in the United States, in fact, I think all the groups, age groups anyway, in the United States are having increasing obesity and being overweight. So, how do we solve some of these problems? Well, taking a big picture approach, it's likely not going to be just one thing, just raising taxes on cigarettes or just increasing the penalties on drinking and driving, but little things that can kind of stem the flow of problems will likely have positive effects. For instance, making drugs and tobacco, alcohol harder to get is a step in the right direction. That has led to decreasing levels of tobacco use. And while vaping has been increasing over the last 10 years, a couple of years ago, the federal government kind of came out and said that vaping is not nearly as safe as we probably think it is, and so they've made it harder to get vaping materials and increased penalties for people using that. Alcohol use is something that could be incorporated more so into health education. All right. When looking at drug use specifically as a problem among teens, but it would apply to adults, this has largely replaced the traditional drugs that perhaps were more common when I was an adolescent. If you look at drugs that were used pretty heavily when I was a teen, that would be marijuana. Well, today that's not considered illegal in Illinois anyway, but cocaine and crack and meth, these drugs are not as commonly used among people as they were in times past, but opium drugs like oxycodone and fentanyl, these drugs have kind of exploded in use among Americans in general, and things that have been more effective in terms of how do you reduce the prevalence of these drugs in the streets include things like doctors being better educated about the potential to misuse. There have been databases that have been created by some states where if a doctor is going to prescribe an opium medication, especially if it's addictive, then they can go into a database and look up the person they're getting ready to prescribe it to and see, have they received a prescription for this sort of medication by some other doctor? Because some people, especially people who are selling it or people who are addicted to it, will go from one doctor to the next trying to get multiple prescriptions from each one. But if there's a database in which the doctors can look up what have other doctors prescribed to this person in the recent past, they can try to avoid doing that. Drug registries, that's the term for that. And then drug rehabilitation, that there are effective ways of treating people who have drug addictions, be that opiate or other things. Laws have been passed in some states, Illinois being one of them, to try to curb cell phone use. So it is illegal to hold a cell phone while driving. That's the law. You can't hold it to your ear. You can't look at it. You can't even use the GPS on your phone. If you need to use the GPS on your phone, you pull over, you use it, while you're pulled over, and then you set it there, but you don't touch it while you are driving. This is an attempt to try to reduce the number of unintentional injuries. All right, well, let's move on to talking about the second age group in this chapter, and that being adults. And adults, for our purposes, are those people who are age 25 to 64. And this age group are those that are entering into their career, perhaps after going to college and looking for a job, and then all the way up to about the time that they're getting ready to retire. Many people's goals is that to retire at about age 65, although I have some misgivings about that age, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter. This age group represents about half of the population, and as we look into the future, that number is expected to remain fairly stable, but meaning there'll be about as many adults in 20 years as there are today, but as a percentage, they are going to shrink because there are going to be more and more elderly people. Well, looking at the things that are killing this age group, chronic disease, meaning not unintentional injury, that's not a chronic disease. This group is probably more mellow. They're not driving their vehicles at 90 miles an hour or, like walking across a bridge because they were dared to or something of that nature, a little bit less, crazy four-wheeler driving and things like that. What is killing these people more often is chronic diseases that are related to poor health behaviors, not exercising, not getting enough sleep, smoking, using alcohol in an unhealthy manner. What's interesting is that today more Americans are exercising regularly and eating a healthy diet. 84% of Americans are wearing a seatbelt. And so on the one hand, we're actually healthier, or we're doing more healthy behaviors than we were 20, 30 years ago, because people understand the connection between going to the gym, eating spinach, and having a healthier lifestyle. Perhaps the issue is like the division of class. Perhaps it's the middle class that are doing the healthy behaviors, and the lower class are the ones that are doing the unhealthy behaviors. Maybe they're the ones eating the chips and smoking and drinking heavily, and maybe that's the issue. But I also could argue that it may be related to the fact that the environment, the air we breathe, the soil that produces the food that we eat is more toxic than it was 30, 100 years ago, and that may be the difference that is causing the chronic diseases. For instance, it is very, very easy to get potato chips and candy bars today. They're in every vending machine. They're in every gas station. They're very easy. They're fairly cheap. Healthy food is actually not something that's available in our vending machines. It's not available in our convenience marts, right? So you could argue that it's harder to be healthier today than it was in the past. If you look at your average loaf of bread, if you look at the ingredients, if you understand half of them, I would say congratulations, you're smarter than the average bear, because there's all kinds of ingredients that in the past would have not been there. If you asked your grandmother what belongs in bread, and she would say something like yeast, flour, water, and salt, maybe some oil. But today they're throwing in corn syrup, they're throwing in all kinds of yeast, stabilizers and preservatives and things that are good for the manufacturer because they keep the bread tasting good longer and keep it from going bad. But our body may be looking at this going, what is this stuff? I don't know how to deal with this. I'll just store it in a fat cell to kind of protect myself from it. So, all right, well, let's talk about the leading causes of death. Our book divides it between 25 to 44-year-olds and then 45 to 64-year-olds. 25 to 44-year-olds, this is unintentional injuries, cancer, heart disease, suicide, homicide, and HIV. Among 45 to 64-year-olds, it's cancer, heart disease, unintentional injury, and chronic lower respiratory diseases, asthma, emphysema, and bronchitis. Cancer is the number one cause of death among adults. Among men, prostate cancer, lung cancer, and colorectal. Among women, it's breast, lung, and colorectal. Cigarette smoking is the most significant risk factor for lung cancer, but I would argue that cigarette smoking affects the whole body because cigarettes, what they do is they coat the lungs, which make it difficult for the heart to receive a good supply of oxygen. And what needs oxygen in the body? Well, every living cell in our body needs oxygen. So it makes sense that cigarette smoking is going to have a negative impact on our entire body, but it's going to affect some places more than others, such as, if you're smoking a cigarette, what is the first places that receives, the toxins of the cigarette? Well, your mouth, your throat, your lungs, right? And then your heart. So those are the places where the most impact of the cigarettes show up. So. And then colorectal, and that kind of goes back, at least in my opinion, to the fact that our diets have changed so dramatically. We do not eat like we did in the past. We have so much more refined food. This is everything from white flour, to Cheese Whiz, and all these sort of newer foods that in generations past they would have not had much access or had zero access to. And so one of the things that happens when you over-refine food, you process it too much, is that you lose a lot of the fiber and the nutrients. But sticking with fiber specifically, that's where you have higher incidences of colorectal cancer. Let's talk about breast cancer. For women specifically, there's been a big campaign for self-examining for lumps in the breast. And so the survival rates have increased significantly due to the fact that there's more mammograms and women are self-screening. That has not happened for men in regards to prostate cancer or testicular cancer. If you go to or at least it used to be, if you would go to some hotels, there would be like a little thing hanging on the shower that would, show women how to look for lumps in their breasts. There was not that sort of thing for men. Health behaviors that relate to this age group: seatbelt use, not smoking, eating vegetables, controlling high blood pressure, exercising. Smoking is still responsible for 30% of the deaths in the United States and is associated with other causes. A lack of exercising, excess body weight, and alcohol use. All right, here's some grim statistics. I'm sure I fit in here just like many other people. Only 26% of men, so that's about 1 out of every 4 men, and 20% of women, which is about 1 out of every 5, and then 20% of adolescents report having sufficient activity levels, which means only 1 out of 4 men are getting enough exercise, are doing enough physical activity. Only 1 out of every 5 women are doing enough activity. Only 20% of adolescents are doing enough. So that's 1 out of 5 adolescents. When it comes to being overweight and obese, 74% of adults who are 20 and over are overweight or obese. Looking just at the obese population in the United States, 42% of Americans are obese. There's a chart on page 156 that shows the dramatic change over time in the populations that are obese. There's another chart here that shows the breakdown based upon states. There are some states that have a greater percentage of people who are obese. Looking at alcohol use, 20% of adults binge drank in the past month. Binge drinking is defined as 5 or more drinks in a single setting by men, or 4 or more single drinks in a setting by women. Binge drinking is associated with homicide, suicide, violence, falls, boating accidents, and driving accidents. Well, what is happening to try to increase the overall health of this population? So one of them is screenings, where doctors are doing screenings for adults to try to prevent them from having the disease manifest itself. And that would be screening people for things like hypertension, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and then for cancer. Diabetes is becoming increasingly common in the United States, and diabetes is a failure of the pancreas to make or use enough insulin. So when we take in sugars, which are very, very prevalent in the American diet. Again, they're showing up in things that in the past they would not have shown up in. For instance, bread. And our body cannot have or shouldn't have sugars floating around in the blood, and those need to be removed from the blood. And insulin is the tool that our body uses to remove and process those sugars. And perhaps due to the fact that we have so much sugar in our diet, our pancreases are having trouble keeping up with that. Again, there's a dramatic increase in the number of adults who are being diagnosed with diabetes. Well, cholesterol, we typically think of this as a negative thing, and it certainly is in excessive amounts. Cholesterol is a soft, fat-like substance that is necessary to build cell membranes. Our body makes cholesterol, but we can also get it from animal products such as your steak that you get at the restaurant. High cholesterol is associated with increased risks of heart disease and stroke. And as a person has more and more cholesterol in their body, the risk for strokes and heart disease increase. So, other things that are being done to increase the health of adults in the United States would include like public campaigns, billboards campaigns that would try to encourage people to do everything from not text and drive and wearing a seatbelt to increasing the amount of vegetables that they have, to spending time with their children rather than working, or spending time with exercise. I've recently seen health insurance companies that are trying to encourage people to exercise by making gym memberships cheaper for people that are enrolled in their health insurance. And certain cities have made it more difficult to buy gigantic sodas. I think New York City has capped the number of ounces that you can buy in a single serving of soda. And so lots of little things like this to try to increase the mortality, decrease the morbidity among this group, and to help people be healthier. So, well, that is all the things that I'm going to share for Chapter 6.